So thank you for joining room 3. I'll be presenting work, joint work with Isis Gaddis, Mimi Oseni, and Amparo Palacios Lopez from the World Bank. And I'm Janneke Pieters from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. The paper I'm presenting is titled Who's Employed? Evidence from Sub-Saharan Africa on Redefining Employment. So what do we mean by redefining employment? What we refer to is a change in the standards for labor statistics that were adopted in 2013 by the International Conference of Labor Statisticians, the ICLS. And so that's a conference that's hosted at the ILO every 5 years. And changes in labor statistics standards are then adopted by the ILO. And so a key change in 2013 was that it was agreed that the production of output that is mainly or only intended for own use is no longer considered employment. And so in the past, production of services for own use were never considered employment. So think about childcare and a lot of other domestic duties carried out. But as of this resolution in 2013, the production of output for own use was also not considered employment and also wouldn't count towards labor force participation for that reason. Although it would still be reported under a separate heading called own use production work. And so what we do in this paper is consider the fact that, the key group of the population or group of workers for whom statistics are going to be affected by this is smallholder farmers, right? So they often produce all or a significant share of their output for own consumption. And so this is going to have potentially large impacts for aggregate labor statistics for countries where a large fraction of the population is engaged in smallholder farming. And so this hasn't really been documented before, and we also think there's extremely low awareness among economists of the change in statistics. And so we want to document this in this paper, which is still fairly descriptive. And we do so by analyzing household survey data from 3 sub-Saharan African countries, Ghana, Malawi, and Nigeria. So the first thing we look at is what fraction of farmers would still be classified as employed if we purely look at their farming activities, so disregarding the fact that they might also be engaged in other economic activities. And so for this, it's crucial that we rely on farmers' self-reported intended destination of output. And so there's not many surveys that ask farmers for the intended destination of output, but we've selected surveys that do, of course. And so what we find for Ghana, Malawi, and Nigeria are the following fractions. So this is the fraction of farmers who would still be considered employed. In other words, who declare that the intended destination of their output is mainly or only for the market. And so we see substantial variation across the 3 countries with up to 70 or 80% of farmers reporting, producing for the market in Ghana, but as little as 20 to 30% reporting so in Malawi and Nigeria. And a second thing that strikes us is that there's a lot of variation depending on the timing of data collection. So for each of these countries, we have survey data for the beginning of the main growing season and the end, and where the end is after the main harvest has been completed. And we see that at the end of the season, more farmers report producing for the market rather than for own use, especially in Malawi and Nigeria. And so when we dig a little bit deeper into this, what we see is that 2 things are going on. The main thing is that farmers work on different crops and also more on livestock production at the end of the season. And those are more likely to be produced for sale. But also for given crops and given livestock products, they're more likely to report that the intended destination is the market rather than own consumption. So there's a shift even within a given crop in the intended destination of output. So then we look at aggregate employment statistics. We do this only for Nigeria and Malawi, for which we have nationally representative household data. And we plot here the employment to population ratio. So what you see is a reduction in urban, but obviously especially in rural areas, which is quite large. So in rural Nigeria, the employment to population ratio declines by 10 to 20 percentage points for women and men. And in rural Malawi, also 10 to 20 percentage points, but then a little bit more for females. And it's important to notice that the extent of this reduction doesn't only depend on how many farmers produce mainly for own consumption, but also to what extent do these, if we call them subsistence farmers, also engaged in other work for pay or profit during the reference period. Because if they have a job for pay or profit for at least 1 hour in the reference week, even if their main activity is subsistence farming, they would still be considered employed. However, they may not necessarily be considered agricultural employment, right? So this sectoral distribution of employment is also potentially going to change if that 1 hour per week, let's say in the extreme case, is spent doing work in the non-agricultural sector. And so the final thing we look at, or the final thing I'm showing you here, is the sectoral distribution of employment. And so this is the share of total employment accounted for by agricultural employment, according to the previous and the new standards. And here we see a huge reduction in rural Nigeria, right? So it's almost halved, the agricultural share of employment. And the reduction in rural Malawi is much smaller, but that's partly because in the Malawian survey data, there's this separate employment category, which is called Ganyu labor, which is not labor on the own farm. And so it's considered employment because it's for pay or profit, but we can't distinguish whether it's in the agricultural sector or not. So we've assumed that it's all in the agricultural sector, but in reality, some of it might be in services or manufacturing. So the overall picture, especially from Nigeria, but also to some extent from Malawi, is that the picture that we see, according to the new standards, is that the rural population is much less reliant on agriculture than the previous standards would have suggested, and also that I think, we think is reality. So by the old standard, 60% of male rural workers in Nigeria would be considered employed in agriculture, but by the new standards, only 30%. And so that's a really drastic change. So some concluding remarks. We see that the revised standards have indeed significant implications for the characterization of employment in Sub-Saharan Africa. We think it's super important that more economists are aware of the change in the official standards. And so it's not even exactly clear to what extent or for which countries they've already been implemented. But the latest sort of trends that are modeled by the ILO in the documentation, it's clear that they use the new definition. It's just not clear to what extent they can actually apply it accurately, given that survey data might not be detailed enough to do so. But generally, if we continue to focus narrowly on the official employment and labor force participation statistics, we definitely risk underestimating the importance of agriculture in total employment and for rural livelihoods in particular. And so finally, the labor that goes in producing farm output, but also potentially other output for own consumption, is no longer considered employment officially, but the output produced is still considered part of GDP. And so it's also possible that we're going to see an overestimation of the level or increase in agricultural labor productivity unless we keep parallel labor statistics that are consistent with the old definition. And with that, I'd like to conclude. There's a link to the paper on the conference website, on the conference program. And so you can unmute yourself and join in with any suggestions or questions.
Just some clarification, if it's okay. So if I have a small farm and I was intending to sell, but at the end I didn't sell, so which one is counting? Or if I just consume some, but sell 80%, so is there a cutoff about that? That's the first thing. The second thing is more practical. So if I now go to ILO website and download the labor force participation, should I be aware that they change it in 2013? The time series will not be compatible?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Great question. So the first one, from the resolution that was adopted, it wasn't necessarily entirely clear, but it looks like the idea is really that what matters is the intended destination of output, so not the realized fraction of output that was sold. And then basically the categories are sort of what you only or mainly produce for the market. And so in the surveys that we use, we also see that farmers are asked, so what's the intended destination of your output? It's only for own consumption, or mainly for own consumption, or mainly for the market, or only for the market. but we think, and we haven't analyzed this further yet, but we think that the shift that we see over time, that for given crops, the intended destination of output changes might definitely reflect things like, unexpected realizations of the weather, or, where you realize your harvest is much better than you anticipated, and so it turns out you're likely to sell the largest part of your output rather than consume it yourself, right? But what matters for the definition is the intended use of output. Relating to your question about the ILO website, I think it's really a little bit unclear still to what extent, and especially for which countries, the new resolution or the new definition has been implemented. And I mean, the ILO, once the resolution was adopted, they started thinking about how are we going to implement this, right, with the national statistical offices. How are we going to redesign labor force surveys? And they're still to some extent in the process of deciding on that. So for sure, it's not been implemented across the board yet, but in their documentation for their model estimates, they do refer to the new definition.
So did you discuss some of what is in the farmer's mind when they answer the question, what is their intention? Is there some distortion there? Would that something related to, I don't know, taxation, any other thing, subsidies, any other things? Would that be something also different across countries?
That's a super interesting question. We haven't looked at that, but I think that's one of the very relevant things to look at in future research.
I have a complementary question here. So those farmers who do not intend to sell to the market, is this mostly people who basically have another job from which they derive significant income, but that maybe like under the old system would have been kind of their secondary job, and then under the new system, this becomes their primary job?
Yeah, I think it's both. So it's also individuals within households who sort of specialize in producing, let's say, the subsistence crop, whereas other individuals might work in non-agricultural activities or in trading. But it's also the same persons having secondary jobs outside of farming, even though their main job would be subsistence farming. Yeah.
Do you think the seasonality aspect that you highlight in this presentation is any worse than the seasonality issues which are common in measuring persons employed in agriculture and such like more generally, when people, for example, say that they're active in the agricultural sector during harvest time, but if you survey them 2 months later, they don't. Do you think that this new method has made that any worse, or is it
Yeah,
just
I do. Yeah, I do think it's worse, primarily because you see that even within, the agriculture work that they do, there's this shift from subsistence crops to cash crops, and within crops from subsistence to the market. Although that latter shift within crops might not be generalizable at all across years or countries, but I think it's sort of makes sense to see that after the main harvest is completed, that people shift their labor to other crops and to livestock rearing, and so you're going to see jumps in employment rates and labor force participation just because the maize harvest is completed.
From your presentation, it seems that this change in classification is like not that much of a great idea, right? But presumably,
Yeah.
presumably they had some good intentions in doing so, right? So are there, what these good intentions are, or are there any upsides of the change classification?
I think one key concern was that the let's say by the previous standards, the employment statistics wouldn't really reflect the underdevelopment of rural areas and maybe other parts of the economy where people who produce output for own consumption aren't really attached to the labor market. And if that's what we want to see in employment statistics and in unemployment rates, then but those are considerations from this committee and the ILO, where academic economists are not necessarily represented very well. So I think our impression from presenting this work and talking about it is that most academics have been quite unaware of this change and are not very happy with it.
Yeah, I would say it more bluntly. This is not a good change, and people should be aware they should stop using these numbers. I think that's the main, Kevin and I ran into this when we were working on our labor force statistics paper. They basically made a large change without warning or telling or consulting anybody who actually uses the statistics, and I'm not sure why. And people need to just know upfront, don't go to the WDI and download these figures anymore. I mean, you're doing a good service, thank you, but be blunter even.